Everyone, I'm completely delighted to have a chance to speak with Ross Byrd today. Patient Kingdom is an unbelievable Substack. I cannot suggest his writing enough. It is elegant and insightful, and he sacrifices neither, which is extremely rare because usually someone sacrifices elegance for insight or insight for elegance. But Ross Byrd has found a way to actually make the elegance and the insight together and one. I've enjoyed listening to him speak. With Joel, I've learned a lot. I mean, the piece you did on tilling is tremendous. I reference it all the time. The piece that you were doing on the generations, the manifest, I could go on. Just wonderful work. And it's also thrilling to know he's a fellow Virginian. So, that's wonderful as well.
Yes,
And
important.
and Ross, we've already, so I'll let everyone know. In a moment, I'll probably cut because we just spoke for 30 minutes. So I'm just going to cut that part and put it here, and then I'll resume and then cut and switch. And so we just got to where we were talking about the piece that he did that I'd like to start with, because there was also a piece where we were talking about geometry and algebra that I think ties in. But he wrote a piece on a kind of dialectic that I think he is correct to identify in the Bible between inclusion and holiness that is going on. And he connects this with Moses. He brings it to logics of atonement. And I think it also fits extremely well with a conception of reality as unfolding. And I really would love to give Ross a chance to speak on that. But please note, at this point in the recording, I'm going to actually put in the stuff we said for 30 minutes because it was a ton of fun. And then we'll just pick up here. So, magic finger. Ross Byrd, how are you, my friend?
Hey,
You're doing okay? It's an honor. It's a pleasure to speak with you. You doing okay?
doing
Oh,
great.
that's good.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so great. So that's wonderful. And Ross, you're a tremendous writer. Your piece, you're very elegant but insightful at the same time. Often people sacrifice elegance for insight or insight for elegance, but they flow together beautifully in your work. So I'm going to press you to make a book. Great. Oh, I'm so
Thank
glad.
you.
Oh, outstanding. Great. Patient Kingdom. I think it's a wonderful anthology title. Magnificent. I'm glad you agreed.
Well, that's very kind of you. It's kind of new to the writing in public is just been about a year-long project for me.
Sure.
So, it's been really fun. A lot of years of writing not in public.
But I think
One,
that's actually really important because it is like in your piece talking about unveiling and holiness and kind of the inclusion. There is something about the artistic life that's isomorphic to that, and by isomorphic I mean it has the same structure. One, there is a danger in writing publicly too soon. There is I always am
oh
taken
yeah,
by characters in the Bible, or we live in a society that doesn't cherish the mid years. If you're not a Forbes 30 top 30 by 20 or by 30, you're a failure and your life will never amount to anything. And you can just wait
yep,
for
yep.
retirement. When really history is a story of the mid years, the 30 to 60, the 40, 50s. And that's really appropriate. But there's such a pressure now, resume building, great, creating a public image and all of that, that I don't think we don't have tilled soil and we don't have properly grown fruit. So I think it's
So
very
true.
important. I think it's very important to have those
That's
years.
helpful to know about Leibniz. That's
What
cool. He's one who stands out to me for other reasons, as someone that I resonate with. But again, I have Cliff Notes versions in my
Sure.
mind.
No, the problem is when he talks about a monad, it sounds
Yeah,
like he's saying everyone is in an isolated universe. What he is saying is that everyone is in a form of, basically, he's saying that I can't inhabit anyone else's consciousness. That's what he's
yeah,
saying. He's not
yeah.
saying that everyone is in some alternative dimension. It's like I cannot experience or represent the world to myself like a plant or like a dog or like a Ross or like a et
Right,
cetera, right?
right.
And so
Yep.
we're all monads that do not intersect in the way we represent the world. But this is the thing Leibniz is asking that is extremely profound, but it's missed because it sounds like he's saying we're in some like windowed spacecraft. What
Yeah,
he's saying is everyone is locked in their own way of representing reality according to object-subject relation. So he has a three. It's a trinity, as we see in
yes. This is
analysis of
what
systems.
resonates with me. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
this is where
Sorry, go on.
Barfield has some, he's spoken with
Exactly.
Farah. He understands this very well. So what Leibniz is asking, he's like, okay, if everyone cannot inhabit one another's consciousness, how is it possible that consciousnesses interact and do so in a manner that is intelligible to one another? The space between consciousnesses are within the field of understanding and is not included in the representation of consciousness. How is that possible? Unless there is something that is sustaining being that is not reducible to representation. And this is where he's like, we have to think about God as sustaining being and also the coordination of representative monads. Because otherwise, why wouldn't the monads, like, for example,
could you say God is love?
Yeah, that's exactly ultimately what it's going to be, because love
it's like has the dark matter that
because love is this weird thing that creates similarity but not sameness. And that's also, and then I'll stop, although I might not, I'll try. Similarity is what Leibniz really wants to hone in on as what Plato means by form. A form is a similarity, which a similarity is very weird because a similarity requires there to be difference, or else there would be the same, and there wouldn't be two things, there'd be one thing. So similarity is when we recognize a pattern that is located in difference. Well, then what are you seeing? What are you seeing when you see a pattern? There is no patterns. If you think in a way, there are no patterns in nature unless nature is patterned. Ooh.
Yes.
What if nature actually is fundamentally an unfolding structure of geometries that are intelligible by patterns, because those patterns are most like it, even though they're always lacking something, because they can never equal the full, right?
Yes.
So thought, so this is the key. Thought, and this is kind of a bit of the piece, thought is most aptly pictorial. Like thought is supposed to be pictorial, actually.
Yes.
But here's the problem. If I think something that's a picture, I don't automatically understand it. So I have to translate it into things it is not, like words or ideas.
You have to make it more abstract than the picture.
That's correct.
Yeah.
I have to make it more abstract to make it more concrete. That makes no sense, but this is Leibniz's point. He's saying, well, you can't separate concrete and abstract. You can't separate pattern and thought. It is all in a dance that makes a multiplicity a unity. So he's also trying to solve the problem of the many and the one. And he's like, it's actually not that hard of a problem if you bring it to geometry. We're always, every moment of every day, in order to make the world function, bringing a many into the one, right? Like you're always doing that. And so he says, so then the Trinity is not weird. The Trinity is actually just the Trinity is just a description of every single act of the human being in intelligibility, where you're taking many into one, right? So the Trinity is not a contradiction. It's only a contradiction in algebra. It is not a contradiction in geometry, and geometry is the realist of the real. Algebra is simply an interpretation of geometry that gives us a way to make it intelligible to us and to coordinate it, and it's useful, but that very use leads to the temptation of thinking that it is reality. You know, we tend to confuse use with reality. And then
to use that level of abstraction to prove things that you can prove which don't exist.
Exactly.
Which aren't,
But within its own internal consistency, it does exist.
Makes sense. Yes.
Yeah. So that's the problem. We confuse coherence and correspondence, and then we're doomed.
So like you said, it's only actually real if it lifts up, or whatever you said, back into geometry.
Exactly. That's right.
It's useful as long as it, let's say, has its telos back in.
Exactly. It has to have the telos. It has to come back into it. You know, it's like imagination. There's this weird thing that people like Florensky and others will say that hell is pure imagination. It's coherence and imagination without correspondence. It's imagination. It's a realm that, because hell is the weird thing that is real but also doesn't have substance. It's there but it's not. Well, how do you make sense of that? Well, it's like a dream. A dream is it would be silly to say a dream doesn't exist, but it also would be silly to say a dream does exist. Like
does exist,
right?
Yeah.
It's in this between space. It's pure metaxis without sides. And so hell has this way of being pure imagination, but it's imagination without beauty. In fact, it's imagination going away from telos. That's the problem. Yes. You know, imagination is supposed to be toward beauty, the telos. But what happens in hell is the trajectory of imagination is away. And you see, the problem is because imagination is not bound by correspondence, you can imagine the most horrible of things. There's nothing you can't imagine. That's the problem. Like, you can imagine anything That's
It
the
is a problem.
problem.
Yeah, it
Because
is a
you can
problem.
imagine anything independent of beauty. And also, if you hate the beautiful, or it comes to repel you because you haven't, in the Cardinal Newman sense, kind of purified oneself to be able to receive it without being destroyed, like Beatrice with Dante, well, then the only direction for imagination to go is toward hell, basically, right?
Yes.
But then the problem is people hear that and they go, wait, are you saying imagination is bad? No, imagination is good, just like all things, if rightly ordered. That's Augustine's stress, right?
Yes.
Everything.
If it sacrifices up to
That's correct.
the more to the real.
That's correct. And so hell is in a sense imagining that algebra is real, where heaven is imagining oneself in a posture toward geometry to be lifted toward the beautiful. There's something where imagination is humbled in beauty, where in hell it's never humbled. That's also another problem. There's a kind of prideful imagination in hell, where there's a humbled imagination in beautiful, where then, of course, imagination has a fundamental veiling and hiding structure in it too, right? Because when I imagine something, I'm simultaneously veiling it from me, but I am doing it precisely so I can bring it to me, right? So it's an inclusion holiness thing too going on in imagination. So that is also where you need imagination in order to think the unveiling with the UN in parentheses. But that very tool, if separated from its towardness to beauty, actually ends up then reversing in the direction of hell, right? But if you didn't have that tool, you couldn't approach the beautiful, so it would be bad of God per se not to give imagination to man, right? Because then God's hiddenness could not be unveiling with the UN, it would be just hiddenness. Like imagination is why you can have the unveiling with the UN in parentheses, right? But if you have it, it leads the possibility of trajectory toward hell, right?
And this is what you mean by freedom to some degree.
Yes,
exactly. At the end of that piece is freedom and forms. The freedom doesn't always lead you towards the forms. It could lead you toward shape that does not have its telos in form.
That's perfectly right. That's perfectly right. And maybe I'll have like a
operating at different levels.
You're but it's the critical thing too. And then I'll do a formal introduction. The issue is that if you're dealing with, if the universe is a geometry, then it has sides. And if it has sides, then it has different languages and it has different ways of seeing, right? And it's like people always talk about the 13 ways of looking at a blackbird, the elephant that the blind people all touch. But of course, as Timothy Keller pointed out, how do you know it's an elephant if you're all blind, right? There's a presupposition in there automatically. And also you're necessarily excluding people who disagree. So, that's always the idea that it's a kind of includes everyone, but actually, of course, still, you can never avoid exclusion. The question is the order of the exclusion and the viewing of it. And what do we mean by exclusion? But anyway, if the universe is a geometry, then it is multi-sided and it can be seen in different ways. And you see, if you take seriously that literature is not merely knowledge, but say a way of seeing, that metaphor is seeing. If you take seriously math is a language and it's a way of seeing. If you take seriously that philosophy, art, I could go on, the body, all of these things are ways of seeing, then we should expect there to be different languages and different emphases and different ways of wording a similar construct that is nevertheless enhanced by the different sides. Once you approach this issue through literature, you gain something you can't if you approach it just through math. But if you approach it just through math, you lose something that you would gain through the language of literature, because ideas are inseparable from their different expressions. It is not the case that if A, B, and C are all saying X, that X is not better for learning all three ways of saying it. Because you see, if you learn all three ways of speaking it and seeing it, you as a subject, multifaceted, make more dynamic your relation with X. Oh, and here's the kicker. If X is itself in relation, then the higher dynamic approach actually changes how X unfolds and what it is in creation, right? So I think very often people are like, well, it's all, what's the point of being generalist, of learning all of these different language games? What's the point, right? Well, because the subject that has learned all of these is a different subject who experiences the X, and therefore the X unfolds differently, and therefore it literally has practical consequences in how well new creation unfolds, right? And so
Absolutely.
so it's really critical. One of the reasons why I'm very bullish on the liminal web, as people call it, is that there are more and more people who are finding one another, who very often, in the very genuine seeking of the truth, wherever it may lead, whatever that may mean, come to language games or ways of wording, basically a relational ontology, that are coming together to word it and language it together, which then enhances the overall subjects relating to it, that then change the X that's being related to, that then changes them as subjects, and you start getting a certain fullness of the relational or the communal ontology that some Orthodox people will say, or the image and likeness of the Trinity, that until this technological moment where you have this YouTube Zoom combination, we really couldn't do. I do think, as they have spoken of the oral tradition and the written tradition, we are in a sense in the Zoom tradition. It will change how the mind works. It will change how people relate. And I do think it's basically our best shot at saving democracy from eating itself. Because democracy is ultimately, as Hunter says at UVA, substantive democracy, which requires the ability from people with different first principles to interact. And if we can't arrange that and learn to do it and see that as all angles of the same X that is actually fuller because of that multi-angle perspective, well, then we're going to give up on human interaction. We'll fall back into governmental tribalism. And there's something to be said about a robust identity, but there's also something dangerous about a robust national identity if it leads to walls instead of... there's a difference between definition and walls. If you don't have definition, you go crazy. But if you have walls, you eventually starve to death on the lack of your spiritual nutrition that can only be found in relation with the other. And so there is something to be said about strong definition, but that always runs the risk of tempting one to remove themselves from the rest of the world, right? And I think we're in the age of that absolute choice. And this kind of activity and technology, I think, is critical for training people into not giving into that temptation of isolationism. There's a danger of saying isolationism, or, by that, there's a danger in saying, well, is being alone in solitude bad? No, that's not what we're saying. It's hard to fully develop without that. It is the moralization of the exclusion of the other because, they're wrong, or they're a threat, right? I think we're in a global political moment tempted by that. But if we're going to also say, well, we don't want to do that, well, what's the field? What's the technology? What is the culture being made to show an alternative to that, right? I think it is happening. From the little corner of the internet, liminal web, philosophy, all of these things are little hubs of what really a new democracy that was not merely a silly voting system that calls itself democracy, but really it's captured by K Street, like a real Tocqueville democracy, which is ultimately just philosophical dialogue for Tocqueville. That's possible now, and we need to really embrace that, in my opinion. But we'll see.
That's a great take. I've been struggling through Hunter's book on solidarity, and struggling. Mainly by that, I mean that he seems to come to it from, let's say, within the liberal order, I guess. And I have gotten myself so used to not thinking in liberal terms anymore that I just, it's not hard for me to agree. It's almost like the whole book is very agreeable. It's like, yes, this is what we need. And yes, this is the problem. But hard for me to imagine that the solution comes, I don't know, from within. Obviously, it doesn't come from within the book. He doesn't fully offer solutions, but maybe even from within that mindset. But the way that you're talking about it now, it makes it much more imaginable to me. This new iteration, let's say, of dialogue. which is transjective in a sense, which is bringing the subject back in, but not in the super unhealthy way of making the subject the center, fully subjective, but philosophical dialogue being renewed on the internet does make solidarity more the kind of solidarity he's talking about more imaginable. So,
well, for me, the problem with many people defending the liberal order, if we call them by liberal classical order, the neoliberal Francis Fukuyama idea of democracy, Washington consensus, et cetera, so forth. It's still assuming an Enlightenment framework. It is still assuming.
That's kind of what I'm getting at.
And it's still assuming that basically rationality can save us. Now, it depends on what you mean by rationality. But the fundamental mistake that I think of classical liberal thought is that the key phrase that I always like to use, it assumes that the true is the rational. The true is not the rational. The true is what organizes the rational, but it cannot be arrived at rationally. So, for example, if you think it's going to rain today, it is logical to bring an umbrella. But let's say it doesn't rain. Does that mean you were irrational? No, you were very rational relative to what you thought was true. It's just that you were wrong. Therefore, it is possible to be rational and wrong. This is extremely important because, therefore, if one says the market is always rational, well, that doesn't tell us very much. Yes, it's always rational relative to what it thinks it's true. Too bad what it thinks it's true can be wrong. Yes. People, rational dialogue is necessary for a democracy to function, but that doesn't tell us very much because everyone is always dialoguing from what they think is rational. That only tells us something if there's a capital R rationality, that's the true rationality, that eventually all freedom of speech will converge upon if only we give it enough time. Now, freedom of speech following Jonathan Rout's Kindly Inquisitors, freedom of speech following Dietrich McCloskey, Habermas, all these different people. You get rid of freedom of speech, you're in huge trouble. But freedom of speech is not about, in my opinion, it is not primarily about the arriving of capital R rationality. The freedom of speech is the necessary preconditioning for the orbiting and the working up toward the beautiful, of which then actually emergently gives us the creative. The point of freedom of speech is to say things you've never thought before. Because does that not happen when you're talking with people? Suddenly you have ideas you've never had. Suddenly you're thinking things you never had. It would be very silly to suggest that conversations are simply the unfolding of a rationality that knew everything it was going to arrive at ahead of time. No, the best conversations tend to say things you never thought. And then you go off and think about afterwards. Without freedom of speech, you cannot have creativity. Creativity is actually the secret to democracy and the acknowledgement of creativity. But the organizing principle of democracy then, following, well, Sindler and Vervaeke and Thomas Jockin and Plato, all these people, is an orbiting of the beautiful. Some people will say the good, the capital G good. I do like the word beautiful. I do think that gets a little closer with Cleon, as Jockin will say, and I think it is the beautiful. I think it's hard to use. I think it's hard to use the word good now without it falling back into moral philosophy.
Yep.
In classical,
which would be a mistake.
Yeah, and again, as Jockin says correctly, much of modernity's problems is a result of the collapsing of the beautiful and the good and treating them as similes, right? That's gotten us in massive trouble. And many of the great disorderings in history are a result of turning words into similes that are not similes. That's usually legion, a confusion, right? So when you treat beautiful and good as similes, then you literally lose a capacity to perceive reality. Like Rita Dove said that about poetry. It's like when a word dies, so does an eye. And I think it's true. And also, too, a reason why, as I was speaking with Matthew about, God is found in the movement between metaphors is because God is.
I was about to bring that up.
He's found in the movement of ways of seeing, right?
Yes.
And, when you get too used to a way of seeing, then you've lost it. So you need to move. But then if you have no way of seeing, you're not seeing at all. So there's a.
I assume that's what you mean by creativity, in a sense.
Yes.
Is that the truth which moves, which must move in order to be true?
Yes.
In a sense, meaning if we are to be a thriving or even functional democracy in any way, then we're going to have to keep moving, not moving in the sort of progressive sense of making progress necessarily, but moving in relationship with one another as we change and present and discover the truth. which does not move, I guess you would say.
No, that's exactly right. Well, the beautiful thing, is that creativity also inherently creates meaning. Because when you are engaged in the creative act, one of the problems is if you overemphasize the word meaning, although I don't disagree with the idea of the meaning crisis or meaning, is that meaning can be, a definition found in a book, or, the universe is meaningful because God exists, right? Meaning has to be felt. Something has to feel meaningful. And the only way to really get the feeling of meaning is surprise. Like something has to surprise you that you did not know was possible, that then shows that the universe is a place where things can be unveiled that you didn't know was there, and therefore it is meaningful. A meaningful universe is a surprising universe, right? Another way to, Guy Senstock put this very well, and Guy Senstock once made the example of the FedEx sign, where the FedEx sign has the arrow in it, the negative space arrow, or am I ruining this? So if you look at the FedEx sign, there's a negative space arrow in it, right? So you can spend your whole life looking at the FedEx sign and never see that arrow. And then one day somebody says to you, there's an arrow in that, right? You're like, what? Look. And you're like, oh. You see, suddenly you're surprised by something you were always looking at but not seeing. Cozzetti had that lovely line at the end of Waiting Barbarians. I was looking at something my entire life but didn't see it. And I think basically a meaningful universe is one where you realize everything is like that FedEx sign. Everything is like that. And that's when it's meaningful. And unless it gets to the place where you experience reality with that kind of potential in it, in front of you all the time, then it's not meaningful in the way that humans long for. Because we desire...
It's not unfolding.
Exactly. That's right. It's an algebraic meaning. It's not a geometric unfolding on different things, which brings us to the topic of the unveiling and inclusion. So I'll pause.
Okay.
And then I'll do an intro, and then I'm probably just going to cut everything into it because 30 minutes went by. And I'll also say that. So I'm going to pause.
Great.
And hey, welcome back. So hey, Ross, if you would speak about that incredible piece. I just love it, and I love your writing. So thank you for being here, sir.
Sure, of course. Thank you for having me, and thanks for those kind words. So yeah, should we talk about holiness and inclusion?
I think that'd be great, because I think it ties with the unfolding matter, because I think reality itself actually entails the same structure of a certain inclusion and holiness we could connect with beauty, as Jockin and others speak about. But yes, please, Ross.
That's great. So kind of an underlying theme, I haven't written a piece just about this, but an underlying theme in a lot of my work is this relationship between holiness and inclusion, which I call sort of opposite running streams, because of course, holiness means to set apart and inclusion means to bring in. And so they're opposites in a sense, or at least they present themselves as such. But the Bible seems over and over again to insist that they must not only coexist, but be in interpenetrating relationship with one another all the time, basically. And that doesn't mean that you end up with this sort of tepid relationship between the two where you find some balance of them. Sometimes the prophets are saying we're moving towards, a certain version of holiness against a certain version of inclusion, or vice versa. There are prophets that move away from Jerusalem into Babylon and just say, accept it, that's where we're headed. And there are others that move back in the other direction and say, we're going home. And I've used the image of a Moses movement versus a Joseph movement to talk about this somewhat prophetically about our moment now. I think it's been a helpful frame to see where we are. A Joseph movement, I think, is a movement of inclusion. Of course, that doesn't mean that Joseph himself is not holy. That's a really important part of his story, and they're always coexisting. But his story really is a story of being moved to Egypt against his will, and then making everything blessed because of that. In fact, bringing the people of God unexpectedly to Egypt to save them from a famine and to redeem them, and even to redeem his relationship with them after he's been wronged by them. And all that happens not only in Egypt, but kind of by Egypt in a sense. It's almost where Egypt becomes the setting, this unholy setting by which God's work has to happen. And the way Joseph sums it up at the beginning of Genesis is what you meant for evil, God meant for good. And that's the story of Joseph. But of course, you turn the page, very next page in the Bible, to the first chapter of Exodus. And what you find is that this movement of inclusion toward an unholy people in an unholy land, which was right, has now reached a kind of saturation point. And there needs to be a new movement. There needs to be a Moses movement. And so Moses is called out. And of course, the people at this point are no longer in copacetic relationship with Pharaoh. They are slaves. They're slaves. And so I have written about this most poignantly, I guess, in saying that I think we're in a moment like that, where the history of us as an evangelical people, let's say, in the United States, has been one where we've seen a lot of the blessing of, let's say, the Billy Grahams of the world being the right-hand man to presidents in a very similar way to Joseph. And the marriage between our evangelical form of Christianity and the culture around us has borne a lot of great fruit. People have filled stadiums, and you could talk about the cheaper or more commercialized aspects of that, but I think it's non-negotiable that something good has come of it. And yet, I think that good has reached a saturation point and reaching a sort of moment as a church where we're in identity crisis. And I think part of the reason we're in this crisis currently is because we've become slaves in Egypt. We're no longer in a copacetic relationship with the outside kingdom, and a new movement is needed, a movement away, I think. And I don't think that means we need to make some new monastic order or something like that. I think to some degree what it means is, whether we want it or not, we're going into the wilderness, because of course the Moses movement doesn't just go to the promised land. It goes into confusion, into a kind of cyclical pattern of trying to figure out who you are and where you are. And we might be heading into, hopefully, a miniature one of those. But I think in a good sense, what hopefully we will do is reclaim holiness in the midst of that, reclaim set apartness. We've grown up with the come as you are. We're just like you. Please come into our church. You'll see just how normal we are, that sort of thing. To a moment now where I think the best evangelism is something like, we're not like the world. We're coming to this place. People will do weird religious things now just to not be addicted to the internet anymore. They'll give me the rosary, give me whatever it is, even if I thought it was weird or judgmental or crazy before. I'll do all the crazy religious things so that I can not be a slave to Egypt. I think even secular people are beginning to think that way. And so it's probably time for Christians to realize that. So that's a bit of a summary of how I've spoken of it. I assume we might get into the more philosophical side of what that means, and apocalypse and atonement and all those sorts of things. But yeah.
Magnificent. One of the things I think that you're pointing out that is extremely important is we tend to think good or bad. Okay, Christianity is in ascent good, Christianity is in decline bad. And the brain is always trying to categorize. Categorization is inevitable. You have to categorize to function, but the map is not the territory, as my beloved Kowalski puts it. And so there's always a risk, though, because when I say to people the map isn't the territory, they nod and say, of course, and then proceed to practically act as if they are, right? In fact,
to live in the map instead of the territory.
That's correct. So ironically, the right ideas can sometimes be more of a threat than the wrong ideas, because knowing the right ideas are easy to incorporate into a self-deception that you are living the right ideas. And sometimes one would be less likely of that mistake with the wrong ideas, right? But that itself points to, I think, something you're getting at. I always think it's really important to think of the brain and a lot of creation and a lot of the body as a coordination mechanism. So, for example, if the body never felt pain, and actually there are people born this way, like if they never have pain, they're actually in great danger because they can't rightly coordinate themselves in the world, right?
Yes.
And so likewise, many things that you would say are bad are actually a coordination mechanism. It might be if you feel this hurts, your body is telling you, don't do that, right? Or only do it a little till you're strong enough to do more, right? And often thoughts too are actually, if thought is ultimately geometrical, to say a big thing, or dialectical or temporal or unfolding, it's not point-based. It's actually more story. Yes. Well, then the mind is actually best fitted for coordination. not determining what is right, but to determine the posture that is toward the right, or has the best probability of being the right? If we could determine what was right, then certainty would be possible, as a Leslie Newbegin says, is the birth of nihilism, because once philosophy came, and theology too, you could argue, became about certainty. Since that is impossible, you end up in nihilism. But as Leslie Newbegin puts it, just because you can't have certainty doesn't mean you can't have confidence. You can have proper confidence, is the phrase. And he was a theologian, philosopher, great mind.
That's a great tool. That's a great word.
It really is. But it also makes sense if thinking and really the whole human is more in the vision of conditioning or posturing themselves towards something versus knowing the something ahead of time, right? And when you use the language of going out of Egypt, going on a journey, going somewhere, temporality, so many of the religious languages in the Bible, well, in many religions, and we'll just talk Christianity here, is a language of going. It's a going to, faithful to a destination that you have faith in, but faith is not merely belief, but a certain posture, a certain faithfulness, like you're faithful to it, which has action and courage are really strong together. Well, that's really a language that better aligns with what we're doing when we think, what we do when we're living, right? And things like, for example, pain. Pain means, well, that's a sign of going this way. And then it's really good, actually, because it helps you coordinate. If you didn't have pain, if you didn't have hardship or difficulty, you would lack signals to know directionality or to know what you need to think. And so the idea of, say, American Christianity being in decline, well, algebraically, that's a disaster. But geometrically, or what I think that means, okay, well, then there's a new direction. All right, don't go that way. That doesn't mean the way we came was bad. That means that to continue to do it now is bad, right?
Yes.
And it's a conditioning, it's a directionality that it's giving you. And I do think it is a directionality in the direction of a certain weirdness, of a certain reclaiming of particularity, of, one of the things we would talk about at Eunoia is a lot of time evangelism is thought about like basically in terms of the good and the true. I will give you the apologetic argument for why Christianity is good, the true, or I will talk about all the moral good that comes from Christianity. So it's in the register of the good, right? Now, again, these are not inherently bad, but ultimately, with the three infinites, you have to get all three or you actually lose them all, right? Yes. And ultimately the third is the beautiful. And I do think the beautiful is the sublation of the good and the true in of itself, right? When you see the beautiful, you naturally think that's true and that's good. But when you see the good, you don't necessarily think it's beautiful until somebody asks you. And then you say, oh, yeah, it's beautiful too, right? But it's not your first impulse. And the first impulse is the revelation. And so likewise, the beautiful, now the Christian, in a sense, the evangelism is the beauty, the attraction, the pulling in, right? Where people see it and it brings them in. I think you spoke to that. There's so many people like, I'll use the rosary. I know it's weird, but I'll do it. Because there's a sense of something weird that's not comfortable, but there's also a sense that I need that my good ideas got me here. So I need something that seems like a bad idea or a crazy idea, right? Which of course aligns with game theory, where funny enough, rationality, all it ultimately does is lead you to Nash equilibria, which is a suboptimal result because everyone does what's rational, right? The only way to avoid in game theory a Nash equilibrium is to do something that seems irrational, but it's actually non-rational, and it's how you break through, right? So basically, to say something large is that the Enlightenment just set us up for a giant collective Nash equilibrium, which is what we're at now. But in recognizing that, there is an opportunity for a sublation, a negation sublation, to use, as Cadell and Hegel, we'll talk about, into beauty. And you see, the beautiful is, in fact, then, in its very absurdity, is precisely freedom from the totalitarianism of the Enlightenment that Adorno or Horkheim talks about, or the nihilism that comes from certainty. The very beautiful then actually moves people out of that. And basically, and of course, the beautiful, moving toward the beautiful is a movement of gaining holiness, because the beautiful is holiness. But of course, and then I'll give it to you on this. The dilemma is that if you experience too much of the beautiful too quickly, it reduces you to ash, as Beatrice said with Dante and Simile. It destroys you, actually. Precisely the holiness destroys you. And so there's a tension throughout the entire Bible of how how to deal with that. We need to approach the holy, but the thing we're approaching can destroy us. Oh,
That's
cool.
good. That's good.
And so there that very problem then is what the church has to think. How do we have a certain holiness that is inclusive in a manner that can bring people in without overwhelming them or destroying them in the process or overwhelming them with guilt, but also having real beliefs, but not introducing them in a manner that is destructive, right? That's an entirely different, and and then I'll give it to you, just any thoughts on anything. It's almost like it's an age, I almost want to say strategy, instead of evangelism as an emphasis. Now, I'm not saying it's no evangelism. That's not what I'm saying. It's an emphasis language. But there's something now, and another word for strategy is, of course, art, the art of. There's a certain art now of a way to go about the church, to go about Christianity, that has a deep awareness of the tension between inclusion and holiness. I'd be curious, any thoughts on anything, please?
Yeah, good. A strategy to me is the perfect word for it. I mean, well, it's let's say not the perfect word because it's not a beautiful word in our moment, but it's the perfect word meaning wise, because at least for me, that's what I've been trying to put my finger on for quite some time. I think that Jesus himself has a strategy to his form of communication. This is kind of what I get to in the center of one of the pieces that I wrote about the master soil tiller. And it is something like this balance of veiling and unveiling. It's a very careful, slow, patient process of helping people to know, really, that knowledge itself must unfold, but only at the rate by which it can be known. And so we're so used to, I think it's correct to say, symbolically, a more masculine way of seeing communication, which is that it is a straight line, and that if I say something, it has been communicated, because once it has been spoken through the megaphone, it is done. It has been communicated. But the problem of communication for Jesus seems much more complex than that. He seems to be much more interested in the subject, in the person receiving it, in the person who is receiving it. And if they have not received it, then it has not been communicated. It seems to be his philosophy of communication, really. And so when you begin the Gospels, especially as a modern person, it can be extremely confusing. And especially if you come to the Gospels with a kind of explanation mentality of what Christianity even is. Like, if you already know, Mark says it in verse 1, here, let me tell you the story of Jesus the Christ, the Son of God, and then I'm using Mark as an example because Mark then becomes, after that verse, the most veiled text about Christ, of the four Gospels. And so he begins with this line, so if you want the information, there it is. But now I'm going to give you the person. And once he gives him the person, Jesus himself refuses to be straightforward in the way that he delivers himself, let's say. And I think that's because he has a strategy. And his strategy is that if I give you myself too straightforwardly, then you will not have myself. You will have, to use some language from another one of your conversations, you'll have a category which tricks you into believing that you have the thing. And I think Jesus knew that. The category already existed, right? It's not even just a modern problem. People had the category of, are you the Christ? And they wanted him to say, yes, I am. And then they wanted to say, good, let's go defeat the Romans or whatever they wanted to do. And of course, this actually happens in the Gospel of Mark. So it's like 8 full chapters of Jesus really quite mysteriously hiding his identity, doing something that would clarify his personhood, truly clarify his personhood, and then saying, don't tell anyone, don't let anyone know that I just did this thing, which, as you're looking at it, you're like, why is this the case? And of course you have modernist scholars who are saying, well, because he didn't think he was the Christ. But it's such an insultingly simplistic way of seeing what's actually going on there, because of course in Mark chapter 8 you come to this pretty radical moment where Jesus finally says, because the disciples themselves have been confused the whole time. It's not random people that he heals, or whatever. It's the disciples themselves who are like, who is this man who calms the wind and the waves? And then he says, well, who do you say that I am? And then they have the famous conversation. Peter finally says, you're the Christ. He gives the category. And then Jesus says, Well, in Mark, he doesn't even congratulate him. In Matthew, at least he gets a short congratulations before the conversation turns southward. But in both cases, Jesus ends up saying, "Let me tell you more. Then I'm going to die." And so and not only am I going to die, I'm going to be murdered by the people that you think the Messiah is supposed to combat and overturn. And this is when Peter says, "No, this cannot happen. This is not the category that I just signed up for a couple of seconds ago." And this is when Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan," of course. And so I know you know all of this, but I think it's quite relevant for every moment, but especially for our moment, and the way that you set up me even talking now is it's worth taking notes on that if we want the world to see Christ. It has to be, it's not only that they can't see Christ if they have the wrong category, it's that it's dangerous to deal with the revelation that you're not ready for. It's both of those things. And the whole Bible is about that. Why is the book of Revelation scary? It's because Revelation is not actually good. To the modern question, like, why can't we see God? I mean, the best answer is because you die. Like, that's the reason. It's actually merciful to you. However many times people want to say, like, oh, if God were there, why doesn't he just show himself to me? There is an answer to that. And if you read the Bible, there's maybe almost nothing that the Bible answers more clearly than you are not ready to see God. That might, that could be like a thesis statement of the entire Bible, especially starting with Moses asking for it, but then going on from there. And, by the time we get to Paul, he's saying, thank God, we have seen God, and we now with unveiled faces are making him known. But even when he says we with unveiled faces, he doesn't even quite mean, this is in, is it 1 Corinthians 3 or 2 Corinthians 3? Anyway, when he says this, he doesn't even mean that we're fully unveiled to God yet, because that still is coming. He means like when Moses comes down the mountain, he has to be veiled because even the secondhand glory of God would kill the people that he's around. So he has to be veiled. So Paul is saying, no, that veil is coming off. We can reflect God, but even we still are kind of dim reflections of him for the sake of the world. And that's good, because if Revelation, if the day of days came now, it would not be merciful. Right. And so the mercy of all of Scripture is that God, very much like the tabernacle itself, it is layers upon layers of coverings in order to layer upon layer uncover, in order for us to see him, and for that, one, not to be a problematic category that we make it into, and two, not to die in his presence.
Absolutely magnificent. And I think you brought up, even when Christ says, I'm the Christ, he immediately says something that the Christ wasn't supposed to do. Thus kind of undermining the very thing, right? And so there's
undermining the category, which is what he's doing. He's saying, to use Barfield's language, you must understand.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So that you can understand. And I think that's mostly what is happening in the Gospels, including the cross itself. It is like the climactic ununderstanding.
Absolutely. Well, it's the weird, it's kind of like the Hegelian logic of the negation of the negation. There is always a negation. This God comes as a man, okay, but I'm going to die. Negation, and that's actually the opening of the space of a new sublation, of a new unfolding that you couldn't have predicted. And if you would have known it ahead of time, you wouldn't have coordinated your action around this man, because you couldn't have understood, and it could have just destroyed you, just kind of wrecked you, right? So there's always, well, it's also, when we talk about straightforward, because as you know, I like to talk about algebra and geometry. There's actually no geometric shape that's straightforward. I cannot see the back of a square at the same time. I cannot see all sides of something unless it is flat, right? But if it's flat, then it's dead. It's algebra. It doesn't exist, right? Like algebra, my argument is that algebra is created while geometry is discovered, right?
Is that what you mean when you say a shape, but not a form?
Yes. Yes, sir.
Okay.
That's correct. So again, shapes can be useful to understand and to approach geometry. And the fact that the human can split geometry into shapes, forms into shapes, means that we can then have an idea that changes our relation to the form, that then changes how the form unfolds, which then creates the opportunity for a new idea. And thus you get all of complexity simply in that division.
Is a shape a limited perspective on a form?
Yes, sir. That's how I would define it. Obviously, some people would say a three-dimensional object is a shape. But I'm arguing
Sure.
it's more useful to make a distinction in the language between shape and form. Otherwise, the word form in Plato and others has this weird, mysterious kind of, we don't really know what it means. But if we understand that a form is a geometric object through time, because time is also a critical component of a form. A shape is space without time, you could also say. It has no temporal dimension. So what ends up happening is the shape, because humans have imagination, as we must, to have this unveiling structure, as we've talked about, it is possible for us to imagine a geometry as simply a shape. It is possible for us to imagine a form as just a shape, right? Because because if we couldn't, our freedom would be limited. And also the ability to make something a lower resolution can also open up ways of thinking to creatively reapproach the geometry that you couldn't do unless you had the map, right? Like,
absolutely, you have to do that.
Yeah, that's right. And so a map affords new relationships to the territory that would not be possible without the map. Oh, and by the way, without the map, the territory would overwhelm you. You'd be destroyed, right? Yes. So you literally need the map. The very way the brain works is the way I've worded it is unveiling with the UN in parentheses, right? Which is the dialectic between holiness and inclusion, right? Like that is how the brain works, literally works that way. And so you always have this problem. Well,
absolutely.
The other
it's the structure of consciousness is the same as the tabernacle. It's the same as everything we've been talking about.
That's exactly right.
In order to see anything, everything else has to be covered.
That's correct.
And then you have to begin as a thinking being to understand that everything else that you're not seeing is covered, or else you become a crazy person who thinks that all that exists.
That's correct. And arguably the distinction between God and man is that God does not have to have the unveiling structure with the UN in parentheses, right? He can have the full being come forth. Now, he can also choose to participate in reality like man, which would seem like to be a limitation on God, but if he chose it, would actually be an expression of his all-powerfulness, right? So that's, of course, the possibility of the incarnation, but it would be an option for God, whereas for us, it's not an option. In fact, to choose it is to destroy it, right? So to destroy ourselves, self-effacement, as I'll put it. So you have this issue where the only way there could be a distinct being to relate to geometry distinct from God, which if we're God, we're dead. And if there's more than one God, arguably that means God cancels himself out, if you want to say, go into that. And then we have to get into the structure of the Trinity and different things. But generally, the defining feature is that there is a different relationship to the geometry, right? From versus God's relation to the geometry, right? Well, what direction could that be in that wouldn't put us above God? It would have to be in an algebraic direction, right? A certain sort of shrinking of the geometry into a shape, right? It would have to go that way to have a distinction, right? Which means in order for man to have a distinction from God, it has to be in a kind of negative direction or a negate. Now, negative is not quite the word. Negation direction. Negation does not mean bad. Negation can be good because going to the map then changes the relation to the territory. As long as the negation goes back up, the negation is actually a creative act, right? Like, and this is also the question of how can man create anything? Isn't it like only God creates because technically creation is ex nihilo and all humans do is cause? Well, God can create in terms of the positive. He can literally add. Humans create in the negation. That's where our creation is, which is not reducible to causation, because I can literally look at something and negate my idea of it. Well, that negation is not caused by materiality. If I look at a cup and say, no, that's not a cup, that's a stage for a mouse to play a guitar on, and I turn it over and it's a stage for a mouse to play guitar on, that negation of what the cup is and its utility is not forced upon me by the cup, right? And I'm able to take the same materiality and make it positioned in reality differently, right? Well, that's human. So human creativity is a negation. God's creativity is, you could say, a positive. It's more of a positive. It's an ex nihilo.
Can I interrupt you there and see?
Please.
Okay, so the way that I want to understand, because I think you might have to even split this further.
Sure.
So the way that I think Barfield and Lewis understood the problem of epistemology was according to the fall in some sense. So they thought that abstraction, I don't know if I'm fully getting them right in this, but because they don't speak of it quite this directly, but it seems to me Lewis speaks of it more clearly in his essay, Myth Became Fact, that in our present form of knowing, we have the problem of a divorce between the abstract and the concrete. That you can know about something while you're not in it, or you can be in it and not know about it, he would say. That's his kind of like very simplistic way of talking about it. I can know my toothache when I have it, but once I don't have my toothache anymore, I could try to express it to you, but I'm too far away from it for my words to be anything other than a poor abstraction of the thing itself. And so he then says that myth becomes a kind of isthmus or bridge between the abstract and the concrete world. And then he goes further and says that incarnation becomes a sort of solution to the problem of myth, because the problem of knowing is this divorce between abstract and concrete. The problem of myth is that it's not real. It's a story it's real within the story, but it's not as real as your chair or whatever. And so he says that incarnation is the realizing of the story. It is basically like to take the patterned reality of meaning and make it into the concrete reality of fact. And so, at least as far as I understand him, I think that he thinks that this divorce in our epistemic experience comes from the fall to some degree. And I think Barfield, maybe even more so, seems to say, look, even if you go back closer to the fall, you'll find that we are more of oneness between the concrete and abstract ways of knowing, that words themselves used to not even be signs and signifiers, but they used to actually just be a kind of encapsulation of the reality of the thing itself. And so, and he's trying to sort of recapture that. He's saying we actually have to go back into language, almost like a fossil record. He says like fossil records will show us about the dead world that we've left behind, but language is actually a living fossil record that can show us our own souls, which still exist, but are buried somewhere like fossils beneath the surface. And if we can, bring up the spirit of language, where it wasn't just a signifier, we can actually revive ourselves or revive our consciousness back into a lot of things that you talk about, back into a reclamation of the subject within the act of knowing. So anyway, I didn't mean to make that as large of an intermission as I just did, but I'm wondering how that relates to what you're saying about this negation.
No, that magnificent. So there's a few things. First, before I forget, it's also, I think, important in the way Jesus does things in this kind of unveiling thing. That is the only alternative to an accelerationist logic that the world is now stuck in, that Nick Land talks about, the technological capital, where everything speeds up and eventually it's like Franz Kafka in the little hallway and you can't turn around, right? The only way to not be stuck in that game theory dynamic is something like what Jesus is modeling, which I would also put with Ivan Illich on doing something that seems absurd, but that's precisely why you can maintain your humanity. Another way that we can touch on is, in my opinion, Jesus models a kind of mode of interaction that actually is a way to escape the trap of accelerationist logics that we are now in with technology. That is the same logic of capital, which is the same logic of institutions, which is the same logic of civilization as a whole. Now, I'd have to trace that out.
I would agree completely. Yeah, I just to add to that, I would say he in some ways, even in his very grammar, and even in the grammar of his actions, because you could see in a sense that his actions are parables. His parables are parables, but every one of his actions is also a parable.
Yes.
And if you take those together, what you find is that he himself is like a gateway, like an invitation back into an integrated kind of knowing. Even the way he uses actual grammar, I was using grammar sort of in the macro sense, but when he says something like, it is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners. If you take that in a kind of objective, explanatory way, especially with Christian doctrine, you'd say something like, well, 100% of us are sinners. Therefore, he's just basically saying, translation, I did not come to call no one, but everyone, or something like that. And maybe some people think of it that way, but he's certainly not doing that, because the grammar of what he's saying is already a meeting of subjective and objective, which is what you've been talking about all this time, which is basically, if you see yourself as someone who does not need a savior, as a person who is not sick and does not need a doctor, you are already living in the world in which you are not sick and do not need a doctor, and therefore the doctor shall not be for you. Yeah. And so the very grammar of his words is a kind of poetry and it is literally what Barfield would call poetry, which remarries the abstract and the concrete, the subject, and it remarries the subject and the object.
Divine. No, 100%. And to me, it all speaks to where progress, the only progress is unveiling with the UN in parentheses. Like, there is no progress without that, because the problem is with the question of progress in history, basically the reason people assume history is getting better is because it looks like it does, because you're surrounded by technology, right? You say, well, it must have an upward trajectory because now I have a computer, right?
Yes.
Well, this computer could be leading you to Nick Land's AI takeover, right? You know, history progresses until it doesn't, right? But really, the idea of Jesus is that progress, which is ultimately spiritual progress, if you will, is a logic of unveiling, UN in parentheses. It is not a technology logic. That doesn't mean technology is bad, but technology is always, especially when we take that word in the technique sense, going to Heidegger and metaphysics, it goes further back. Technology is always threatening, human history with its own self-enclosed history of its own efficiency to entropy. To what you were saying,
you can see technology, and I don't know if you would relate with this, but technology itself is a kind of atonement. It is a kind of covering.
Yes.
You're right. The fig leaves are the very first technology in a sense. It's like, oh no, we're naked. We need a supplement for ourselves. We are no longer enough. I'll grab the fig leaves to cover me of my nakedness, but they are a false covering. So it's the intuition, I need atonement, I need covering, is not a bad intuition, but the fig leaves will not do. And so then God also partakes in this technological relationship, let's say, in giving them a more costly covering, a covering of death in a sense.
Yes.
And he says, look, you're going to, now you've gotten yourself in this mess, I have to kind of give you a double-edged sword. And every covering from then on, especially the ones that God gives, are double-edged swords. Like, the mark of Cain, it's the same sort of thing. It's like, okay, this is going to protect you, but it's also like your shame itself. And so both of those things are happening. And if you don't have eyes to see that the technologies that you're using, which we do need supplements, I mean, we would die without clothing, whatever. But if you don't have eyes to see that very thing is a double-edged sword, it is something that shames you, that should actually shame you in the sense, technically, it shames you because it should remind you that your destiny is to be uncovered. Your destiny, the perfect technology would be the technology that isn't a technology, where you're no longer, trying to get smaller and smaller with our different technologies. We just be like, where the technologies disappear and you are enough, but you can't get back to Eden very quickly. And so the road there is a veiling, is a covering, and hopefully accepting God's coverings more than our own. But even God's coverings will be a kind of double-edged sword that lead to unveiling, that lead to revelation.
I completely agree. Technology is a trade-off. You gain and you lose, and you need to be very aware. I also associate, and then to the extremely important question on the epistemology. There's a way I've thought about technology as kind of the serpent. The serpent is always an interesting, at some points it's a bronze serpent, other times it's Satan. Yeah. It's
That's
weird
a good
thing.
example. Yeah.
And so technology, as Matthew was saying, Moses, if you grab it by the tail, it will turn into a staff. Well, snakes you're supposed to grab by the head. So there's a little revelation where often the best ways to use technology are the ways that seem like the wrong ways to use it. And that's often how you maintain the human relationship. And Ivan Illich was big on that. Technology is dangerous.
Yeah, he's brilliant.
He is. I completely agree. Technology is just simply dangerous. And the question is, as we've talked about with Carl and at Philosophy Portal, we are faced now with this moment of history, which I like to call kind of the Calzer moment, based on Andrew and Alex's book on theme, is and not to elaborate on any of that because I'm cruel, is that we're at the moment where we have to decide if technology will replace us or if technology will extend us. It's the question of the replacement of humanity or the extension of humanity, and that's a matter of being wise as serpents, paying attention to the particular dynamics of every technology. The way the cell phone changes the human is different from the phone on a wall. The way that TikTok affects you is different from YouTube. There's a certain shrewdness where simply saying technology is bad or technology is good will not do. You have to go into every technology with an awareness of how it affects you and ask yourself, what would it mean to grab it by the tail, right? And the technology won't tell you. You have to work on your own wisdom and discernment. I think is the challenge now. And we have to be very discerning about that.
Just to one
Please.
quick comment on that. The grab it by the tail is such a great parallel to the way that I talk about it is tricking the trickster.
Yeah.
These technologies are sort of like genies, and the genie story arc is one where you actually can get something from the genie. It's not always like, oh, stay away from genies, they're tricksters. There's a deeper story arc there, which is like, okay, the genie is there and he's offering you everything. Don't be tempted to think that this is a simple bargain. Find out how you can trick the genie into getting what you actually want. The Rumpelstiltskin story is about that. You sort of have to name the thing, and then you can have not only what it gives, but freedom from it. But if you think that you can just get whatever you want from it, you're going to become a slave to it.
Your piece on the genie was magnificent. That's a tremendous, and I think there is a way to look at many of these folklore stories, if you will, as actually parables of technology. I think that's very astute, and I think the genie is a perfect.
Genie comes from a lamp. It is very much a technology story.
It is a perfect metaphor. I think it's extremely useful, and that's also an example where metaphor is useful, because once you think of technology as a genie in the way you've described it, it has practical implications for how you use the technology, right? This is where stories are not merely decorations, as people like Hofstadter or Richards or Postman, or, what was it? Roger Scruton said something like, it really does matter what illusions, what stories, what descriptions you have in the treasure chest of your soul. Because, if you open that chest and you're looking for a way to understand what's going on and there's nothing in there, you're going to be weak, because there's a way in which language, as a technology in the good way, actually provides a certain self-defense against notions that are in the air that, if you can't properly frame, could take you anywhere. And so,
like not finding out Rumpelstiltskin's name.
Exactly.
You're still the slave.
Yeah, but that's a beautiful example. If one has not read the books or the metaphors, it seems like, well, that's just that's all just preference. It's just an option of entertainment. But really, it's going to determine if you know Rumpelstiltskin's name when he shows up. And if you haven't done it, you're in trouble. I always like to associate philosophy with self-defense, with David Hume and different things. Like it really does matter.
Yes.
On what you were saying on imagination with Barfield, Lewis, et cetera, so forth. Because I think it's extremely important question. So for me, I associate, probably, if I were to say Adam, the way Adam before the fall experienced things, because I think Barfield, when he's talking about, we tend to assume that prehistoric man had the same qualitative experience as we do today. And that's an assumption we should not hold. They literally could have experienced the world differently. Thomas Nagel famously asks, what's it like to be a bat? And there's this idea that there is qualitative differences, very qualitative, as I like to put it, differences in consciousness. And we make an assumption to assume that the qualitative experience of humanity is constant. Mr. Barfield suggests, if we look at how language works, it is not. That, and I think using literature as the fossil evidence of qualitative changes is very astute. It is certainly the case that if we look at a book like Momensis with Eric Auerbach, the kind of story we see in Homer is different from the kind of story we see in the Bible, which suggests a different qualitative experience of reality, on a difference between the existential versus the entire unveil. What we see in Homer, we could say, is complete unveiling with the UN not in parentheses. What we see in the Bible is unveiling with the UN in parentheses. And that is reflected in the literature. And I think it's interesting to actually think of perhaps Greek as unveiled with no parentheses, Judaism has a certain emphasis on the veiling, and then Christianity as kind of a UN parentheses of the unveiling, which is only possible because of the others, right?
I agree. That's good.
And that is reflected, I think, in the literature, right? But if I were to say on Adam, there's a way in which I wonder if Adam's experience or optimal human experience is like a no-knowledge proof, which means that you're able to look at something. A no-knowledge proof in computer science is the idea that you can see one frame and in a sense, it's true, or that's the actuality. You don't need the rest of the equations. You don't know anything that a no-knowledge proof, the answer of maybe 20 years of computing simply in the initial act of apprehension, right? Which is an incredible moment of suggesting imagination and thinking are just like that, because the imagination apprehends the whole without computing the whole. And this is a really, in my opinion, almost has to be the negentropic version of the brain versus the entropic. Because here's the thing. What causes entropy? The use of energy, obviously, right? But more technically, it's the use of energy that is useful. You lose useful energy. It becomes disordered energy is what entropy is. It's not really the destruction of energy. It's the loss of useful energy, which means it's out of order, right? Mm-hmm. Well, every time I calculate, I try to solve something, I am using entropy, right? And the problem is, because the brain calculates for us, then the brain is using usable energy in the act of apprehension. That means it is always limited in how much it can apprehend, right? Mm-hmm. And even if you fully apprehend one thing, you didn't apprehend the second thing, and you're always going to be lost in a calculation problem, is how you could put it. There's a kind of calculation. Yeah, so there's an issue where if you have to calculate things, entropy will win. Like now also what's very interesting is I would argue the act of apprehending something is inspiring, or you feel energy. There's something negentropic. Negentropic is the opposite of entropy, where you actually feel order building up. So there's something about no knowledge proof, which is this interesting act of apprehending the whole without calculating it, which means it's in the imagination register, which here's the funny thing. Although let's just say this, imagination and thinking, they are technically distinct. In the act of no knowledge proof, they are practically the same. There's no practical distinction. And you could argue from the fall that the practical distinction widens. They more and more widen. But at the beginning, because you see Adam, there's that tradition that when Adam names the animals, he's not simply arbitrarily picking names. He's like apprehending the essence. Like he's apprehending the form, right? So it's a kind of no knowledge proof, right? He's just able to apprehend the no knowledge proof. And arguably, moments of beauty are no knowledge proofs. You apprehend the whole even if you can't calculate it, right? And
that's sort of what I'm getting at. Yeah, that's right. And the tree seems to be, even in its good and evil, it seems to be a sort of bifurcating of that knowledge where it itself...
That's correct. And so the interesting thing is, for me, what ends up happening with the fall is there's a splitting practically of imagination and calculation, or think. I'm just using the word thinking here, right? Good. But it is not one that can't come back together. And to your piece on Eden not being perfect, that's what's very interesting, right? It's good, but it's not perfect. There's something here where the Eden no knowledge proof is good, but may not be perfect. That it
completely,
it needs something of Christ, right? And you see what's interesting then is what happens when you're able to calculate when you have, there's a way in which if humans can't calculate, there's something of creative possibility that's lost, because when you're able to actually follow the thought to arrive at why the animal is named Panda, or follow the thought to arrive at the no knowledge proof, that's actually an extension of beauty. Like you actually can see the life in it, right? There's a way in which the calculation is actually, if rightly ordered, a witnessing of the depth, right? And if humans can't witness the depth, there's seemingly something problematic. Well, actually, this is what you could kind of say is perhaps Adam had a no knowledge proof apprehension, but because he didn't calculate, there was a certain lack of a depth to the beauty. There's a certain lack of depth to the beauty, right? That then gives it a certain holding you to it, right? Whereas humans, now by going through the calculation to arrive at the place of our beginnings to know it for the first time, as Mr. Eliot says in Little Giddings, there's a way in which the no knowledge proof is actually made more robust and more beautiful, actually. And maybe I think the way to think about it is it seemingly has something to do with love, because love is an interesting thing where when you love someone, there's a whole history there with that individual, with that Beatrice, that is simultaneously not thought about, and yet there in the apprehension of the beautiful, right?
Yes.
And seemingly, there's a way, now I cannot necessarily justify this, there's a way in which there's a certain lack of love between Adam and Eve, because who's the first one that Adam throws under the bus? Eve,
Yes.
right? And also the very fact that Eve would offer, the apple also suggests a certain lack of perhaps trust, because, that gets into your piece on trust and trustworthiness, right?
Yes. Yes.
And so, which I think was a tremendous piece. So there's also a way in which the marriage bond, perhaps we could say, something is broke with Adam and Eve. Now, I also think it's very interesting how Eve is not named Eve until after the fall. It is Adam, which I think is very important, because one name, one essence, two persons. There's something Trinitarian about that.
Yes.
And so there's something about no knowledge proof that without calculation lacks some kind of depth of love, lacks some kind of risk, some sort of holding to it, some sort of glue, right? There's something about calculation that glues. Unfortunately, there's something about calculation that gets you stuck. You also, because it glues, you get stuck in it and you never get to the beautiful, right? So there's some sort of right relation. Now, this is where I get into the negation. The reason why I emphasize the negation in the act of calculation, because you could argue beauty fundamentally humbles. There's something interesting about humility and negation. What humility is to beauty, negation is to calculation. And the reason why I emphasize the negation is because usually when you're stuck in calculation, what you need is not to go forward in the calculation, but a certain negation of the calculation, and then you're free and you can keep going, right? It's like those Chinese fingers.
Perfect. In a way, it is actually, it is grabbing the snake by the tail. Because you could see calculation, sorry to interrupt, but the way that I'm conceptualizing of it is that calculation itself is a kind of technology, right? So and I think you're proposing that you could imagine that same kind of calculation would have been necessary even in Eden. But maybe let's say it's unfair to say this, but that there could have been some unimaginable other thing that was not calculation, that was maybe even more integrated and relational, that was like growing from child to adult in a fully relational, integrated way, where it was still not perfect, Adam and Eve, but the perfection would have come, you could imagine, without what we now know to be calculation. But then after the fall, maybe calculation is the way by which we get back. It's almost, very similar to the technology of the city, right? So cities are problematic in all kinds of ways. And yet the Bible ends with the New Jerusalem. With the city, the technology is itself redeemed. It becomes even better. Let's say the redemption, what we meant for evil, God meant for good. So the redemption of the city becomes maybe even better than what the garden would have been on its own, or something like that, we might say. And so in the same way, calculation seems to me to be something that is going to haunt us and is going to bifurcate, is going to make our knowledge problematically divorced from itself, unless you grab it by the tail, like you said, unless you use it humbly, unless you allow it to negate itself, in a sense, as a part of the process. So anyway,
1,000%, I agree with all that. And I completely, it's also Nineveh, that magnificent city, as Keller emphasizes in some of his sermons, right? So there's this interesting way in which, there's always been this kind of, in a lot of movies, idea, country good, city bad. Some people talk about Star Wars, high technology versus the humble farmer. And there's truth to it, but the Bible does not throw the city under the bus at all. There's a suggestion that the city is magnificent. The issue is the city as a logic to itself without observing anything beyond it, right? It's the city. It is interesting to think, I've not written on this, so my thoughts are not complete. There is something interesting about, the Tower of Babel, where it's almost like the problem is a city that tries to control the vertical, right? It tries to, as opposed to a city that is honoring the fact that the vertical must be outside of it, right? There has to be this point of incompleteness, the veiling, so that it's unveiling, right? Like, that's the weird thing. Like, a city has to have the unveiling structure with the UN in parentheses, but it doesn't do that if it tries to own the vertical. The vertical has to be that of which is absent from the unveiling, precisely so that the city is a veil of it, precisely so that you can handle the vertical as opposed to destroy it, right? So there's
that's good.
So there's a way in which the city, and then of course, as many sociologists point out, the New York State is mostly farmland, right? It's all of that farmland. Cities require farmlands, and then of course farmlands require cities for markets, right? These things go together. So the logic of creation is perpetually this certain sublation is the Hegelian language that I like so much, which is a gathering up the old into the new that leaves the old behind in its accidents, but brings the essence of the old into the new. So there's this leaving behind, but only the stuff that should be left behind, right? Like sublation in Hegel is the process of the essence, the form of the old being identified and brought into the new. And if you don't have that movement, then you actually can't tell the difference between the accident and the form, the substance, the beauty and merely the symmetrical, perhaps. And so, it is interesting.
It's like when Jesus says the kingdom is like the man who brings out treasures old and new.
Yes.
And then maybe to relate it fully, he literally says, if you build a tower, you must count the cost. So, there is, I mean, that's kind of what we've been talking about for the last hour or so, in a sense, is, okay, like towers will be built, not Babel, but the city will have to be built in a sense, in the place of the garden, but you have to sacrifice, you have to count, you have to make negation be a part of it. I think I mentioned to you before, I call it ritualized subtraction. So much of Jesus is learning how to give up the thing that you want so that you can have it, like Abraham and Isaac.
Absolutely. And it should just be noted, in complexity science, and Jim Rutt will talk about this, and Stuart Kaufman and other people, there's this question of where does complexity come from? If the universe is all entropy or whatever, where do you get negentropy? Where do you get complexity? What's very interesting is complexity is a result of entropy being entropic on itself. Like it's a kind of efficient entropy, if you will. What that means is complexity comes from negation. It does not come from addition. It comes from when entropy negates itself in its effort to be more entropic. Almost like, the devil being tricked on the cross, it actually creates complexity, right?
Exactly.
And so this is why I do think a lot of the stuff you see in, say, Christian theology is this idea that humility, negation, all of these things actually make things better. And you go, well, that's silly. Well, actually, again, not that I'm saying that theology has to be, backed by science or other things, but it just should be noted that there is negentropy. We know negentropy exists. It absolutely exists, because if not, there wouldn't be a universe. When the universe started, it would have been flat and it wouldn't have gotten going, right? So we know that the universe can create usable energy, and we also know it can create complexity. So the question is how? The way it does is by negation, basically. It negates its entropy in its order to be more entropic, and that, in a sense, tricks it to actually create complexity, to create higher forms of life of higher complexity. So the funny thing is, this is the idea. We will actually have more creative uses of technology, and I know we're coming on time, and I don't know where the time went, so we should talk tomorrow. Is that the funny thing is actually, and you see this in the history of invention too, a lot of the best inventions were accidental applications of a technology. They were a mistake. They were a eureka, right? Oh, I didn't think of that, right?
Exactly.
Like a lot of humans' greatest insights were sideways, just like Jesus speaking. They were not direct. They arrived at by an
zigzag.
And then it came a zigzag. That's correct. And so, the thing is with technology, a lot of the times you get your best uses of technology when you use them differently than how they were intended. Like the people who created YouTube, they never intended for it to be used for people to do liminal web X things, corner. No one intended new marketplaces of democracy, if you will. Nobody intended these things, right? And yet, as Paul Virilio tells us, when you invent the ship, you invent the shipwreck. Likewise, when you invent the thing, you invent all of the possibility of its use. The funny thing is, technology naturally trains us to use the technology in a linear way, right? You actually, in a weird way, if you let the technology train you into your use of it, you don't realize the fullness of the technology, because that's found in the human technology partnership, where the human still thinks like a human as they use the technology and notice, hey, actually, I could use it for this instead of just for that. But if technology had its way with us, it would actually in a funny way be an insult to the technology. And I think this is, to me, that kind of goes to the calculation issue. To use calculation in the way that calculation habituates us to use it is actually a kind of insult to calculation. It's a kind of devolution of calculation. Calculation is meant for imagination. It is meant for the beautiful, right? Because again, if I take the geometrical and I can bring it to the algebraic, that means I take the unfolded and fold it back. Well, then I can unfold it a different way. And I can then fold it and unfold it. You have this movement now, right? Where because I am able to flatten, I can reemerge. So flattening is not even bad, only if you get stuck in the flattening. Shapes are not bad, only when you start saying the shapes are real. That's idolatry, as we know from the what Mr. Barfield teaches us is basically
That's
things
right.
are idols, is because you're saying they are their own grounds of existence, right? You're saying that's
Their
why
own
it's all
end.
about
Yes.
relationships, right? Well, there's a weird
Yes.
way when you talk about shapes in algebra, you're talking about idols because they are the whole. Geometry is never the whole because it's temporal. The very fact that geometry is always in regard to a temporality in which it's unfolding means it is never finished. It is never the basis of its own ground. It is always unfolding anew, right? So it's
Yes.
always, it's never an idol, it's always a sacrament. Because what's the difference between an idol and a sacrament, right? Like an idol points to itself, a
Yes.
sacrament points beyond itself, right? Well,
Yes.
geometries as being temporal are always pointing beyond themselves, right? But the same object that can be an idol as algebra can be a sacrament as geometry per se, right? With the temporal
Yes.
dimension, right? So the issue is by turning things flat, you allow new ways of unfolding. So calculation can be like, well, let's bring it in, recalculate. Let's bring it down. Let's go, and you have the fullness of human cognition. And I think the key to it then is it's all about the ordering. It's all about the question of what is most real. Is it geometry or algebra? Okay, it's geometry. All right, well, how do we know geometry? It has to be through a process because you can't see all sides of an object at once. Okay, patterns are real. Patterns are things I experience or imagine, but they're not meaningful to me until I calculate them, of which is the act of risking them. So I have to risk them in order to make them meaningful. So I need to bring them back to the Holy of Holies, per se, so it is not lost. So I'm always in a movement
Yes.
of unveiling. And that means I have to do that day in and day out. It is never
Yes.
over. And I can always be surprised, which means there can always be a meaning that is not merely a syllogism, but a strike of beauty that comes forth and transforms. So I think those go together. There's a million more things to say. I've really enjoyed speaking
I
to you.
like the image that came to mind when you were just saying that was you don't want to ride a horse where the horse is the one deciding where you're going, right? It
Yeah,
won't work very well. And so you have to learn. This maybe goes some into what Andy Crouch talks about, devices versus instruments or
yeah,
something
yeah,
like
yeah,
that. You
yeah,
want
yeah,
to make
yeah.
sure that you're using your technologies as instruments, meaning don't even get on the horse until you have someone who's teaching you how to be the master of the horse. Because if you're not the master of the horse, it won't it will be even an insult to the horse, in a
Yeah.
sense. And so you that seems to be a pretty profound insight into, I think, the way that dominion works and the sort of stacking levels of dominion is that we have to make sure that we can be the master over nature, not as though we are negating nature or something like that, but we're actually glorifying nature by finding our place as someone who can instrumentalize it in the best and most beautiful ways possible, as opposed to someone who, like Lewis says in Abolition of Man, man's conquest of nature becomes nature's conquest of man.
100%.
And if you think you just have conquest over it, you're actually being used by it, and it's riding you. So
Completely. And the last things I'll say, and we will absolutely have to speak again, and I forgive all the technical problems, and you are awesome, is that basically, to say something provocative, calculation without imagination, as we've put it, leads to the logic of techne that becomes the logic of capital. Not that capitalism is bad, but capital outside of social imagination becomes auto-cannibalistic, which is a loaded sentence that I'd have to explain. But it becomes capital, which
yes,
then leads to AI. Basically, the problems of the modern world, you could say, or the world of 2025, is we are now facing the results of a calculation that has been dehumanized and outsourced to systems, institutions, and technologies that have a life of their own. And
yes,
basically, the question is, will we change course or will we rise to that occasion? Now, if we do, it's not necessarily a mistake because you sublate all this into a higher beauty, as we've been suggesting. But there is a real choice. And I think it does tie to the question of dominion. The great vegan Gregorian would stress this, is that who has dominion over the woods? The one who can go in with the skill to survive amongst the trees, to do a tent and survive and, find themselves in nature and enjoy the trees, or the one who has to cut it all down? Who's really stronger? Who's really the one who has dominated
Exactly.
nature? The one who has to destroy it, or the one who can live amongst it? And I think
The
basically
proper relationship between the masculine and the feminine.
that's exactly right. And I think basically whenever you have this language of dominion or rulership, et cetera, so forth, you don't rule that of which you have to make submit to you. In fact, you're weak. That's always the revelation. The one who has to cut down the forest is actually weak compared to the forest. The one who can go into the forest and live amongst it, that is the strong one. Strength does not erase. Strength dwells. And our concept of, I think, dominion needs to be linked with the Ivan Illich dwelling. And I do think humans are meant to dwell because it is a place of dwelling that we can experience the beautiful and have conversations like this. So, Ross Byrd, I've enjoyed every minute of it. Thank you, sir. We will talk again. I've really enjoyed it, sir. It's been a complete delight.
It's been fun. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Absolutely. We will do it again. Thank you, Ross. I appreciate it. Best to you, sir.